Good afternoon. I want to thank the Texas Alliance of Groundwater Districts for inviting me to speak to you today, and I want to say hi to all my friends out there. I can't see any of you, but I know you're there. I'm going to talk to you today about the challenges posed by House Bill 722, the bill that provides guidance or requirements for permitting for certain projects in the brackish groundwater production zones that were designated under House Bill 30. The legislation is addressed primarily to groundwater districts that are overlying these brackish groundwater production zones, and overall it mandates the content of the rules on that subject and requires rules on that subject. It's codified at Texas Water Code Section 36.1015, and the rules are supposed to address the procedure and standards for permit applications, the content of permits, and the approval of the permits themselves. Now, HB 722 purports to just apply to two types of permits producing from these zones: those that will produce and treat brackish groundwater for municipal drinking water, and those for electric generation projects that will use brackish groundwater. One of the questions that has arisen because of 1015C, rules adopted under this subsection apply only to a permit for the municipal drinking water or the electric generation projects, whether anybody else can be made subject to these rules. And I would argue, yes, you can use these rules for any projects in your district, except for the parts that implicate or involve the Texas Water Development Board. And my reasoning is that you groundwater districts already on big projects require monitoring wells. You already require modeling. You already require annual production reports, probably for all your permits. So that other technical stuff can be the same, just not the Texas Water Development Board part. The legislature specifically set out goals: greater access to the brackish groundwater, simplify the procedure, avoid the delay, make it less expensive, provide flexibility, and be consistent with property rights. And we'll revisit this at the end of the presentation to see how we're doing on those things. Key provisions of the new statute include mandatory and discretionary rulemaking, permit application process and procedure, contents of the applications, annual reports, what is the water board's role, and the relationship between the MAG and the zone and the permits. With regard to rules, basically the legislation says that districts can adopt the rules at any time they want. So that's the discretionary part. But if they receive a petition to adopt rules, then they have to adopt rules, and they have to adopt those within 180 days. So, for example, in the Kennedy County Groundwater Conservation District that I represent, the board decided they wanted to get ahead of the game. They didn't want to be restricted to 180 days. And so we're doing rules now. And I think that ultimately that was a wise decision, because we've been working on them since late last year. Now, granted, the COVID situation set us back a few months, but nevertheless, we're not finished yet, and every work session is very complex. So we haven't even formally proposed the rules yet after all these months. overall, the permit application process has to be just like the way that the groundwater district processes any other permit application. Actually, the statute says any other permit for fresh groundwater well, but we know that a lot of y'all are using routinely brackish water, brackish groundwater over 1,000 parts TDS, parts per million TDS. And so I think that the logical reading of this statute is just, you have to treat them the same as any of your other permits. But if there's any discrepancy between those two types of procedures, then House Bill 722 procedures control. So what needs to be in the permit application? The proposed wellfield design and its relationship to the zone, a modeling report that's showing the expected effect of withdrawal on the water level and water quality, not only in the zone, but also in the underground strata surrounding the zone, the proposed monitoring well system, the maximum groundwater withdrawal rate that is requested by the applicant. And then I would say that you must also have in your application the requested maximum annual withdrawal amount. And that's because other production requirements speak in terms of maximum annual withdrawal amount, even though the subsection having to do with content of the permit applications only speaks in terms of rates. The applicant has to request a duration for the permit, and under the statute, if they request, anything under 30 years, you have to give it to them. In Kennedy, it doesn't really apply because we have perpetual permits for all of our permits. And then any other information required in the district rules. Now, we saw in a couple of sessions ago that section 36.113C8 had been amended so that it has to be in the rules and they must be reasonably related to an issue the district is authorized to consider. And there's similar language in this statute as well. The Water Board has to perform the technical review of the permit application, and they have to make very specific findings as required by this law. The statute itself doesn't give a lot of detail as to the permit application except for the key points that I summarized a minute ago. And so the Texas Water Development Board staff started drafting a guidance document late last year when John Myers was still at the board. And it's designed to flesh out what information the Water Board would like the GCD to require in the applications so that they could make the findings that they have to make. They don't want to end up with applications that have to be sent back because there's not sufficient information. Their technical report has to include whether the wellfield design is compatible with the zone, and it must give recommendations for the monitoring well system. There is no deadline for the technical report, but no district hearing can be scheduled until the technical report is received by the district. So what we end up with is the 722 requirements about when the hearing would be held, and the 36.114D and E requirements that say that a permit hearing has to be scheduled within 60 days after administrative completeness of an application. And they're not conflicting in the sense that one supersedes the other. So my take on it is, and what we've done in the Kennedy rules, the rules should contain exactly what it means for an application to be administratively complete, how the notice will go out, and in the Kennedy case and in all the other rules I've drafted for other districts, we have added together the technically administrative complete processes, and then we start running the 60 days after that. What you don't want to end up with is you say it's administratively complete, the 60 days starts running, and you haven't even received the water board technical review. And if there are adverse findings on that technical review, then you're going to have to go back to the applicant and get more information. Meanwhile, the 60 days continues to run. So you don't want that to happen. Another topic that is covered by HB 722 are the annual reports. The permit holder themselves have to do annual reports to the district that have the amount of groundwater that they've withdrawn, the average monthly water quality of the produced groundwater, and of the water in the monitoring wells, and the aquifer levels in the zone and in the surrounding formations. The groundwater district has to do an annual report in the Gulf Coast aquifer, for example, on subsidence measurements. And then all of that information goes to the Texas Water Development Board. The board is required to also take another role in these HB 722 permits. If the district requests the water board to investigate whether there's been a significant aquifer level decline, a water quality negatively affected, or subsidence, and that generally will be based on an annual report. As soon as a district requests that investigation, the time limit starts running on the water board, and in this instance, there is a deadline, and it's 120 days. Once the report is back to the district, if there are any adverse findings, then the district can begin involuntary amendment of the permits. Now, Kennedy already has a provision on involuntary amendments of permits, and so we've just added some provisions to that. But for both processes, the applicant is allowed notice and hearing, just like you have under subchapter M. The legislature has suggested that the district may change the production limits or impose a mitigation plan, and I would suggest there are other remedies that the district is authorized to do as well. I want to move on then to one of the topics that I think is the most complex, and maybe that's because I'm not a technical person, but I feel like my technical friends believe it's quite complex as well, and that's the relationship between the MAG and the zone designation memo. Well, first of all, a GCD cannot limit production from a zone, only projects for municipal drinking water and electric generation. So you will have other permits issued for other uses producing water from a zone, and you might have exempt wells producing water from a zone. So on that basis, you look at the statute, and it says that withdrawals and rates of withdrawal from the zone cannot exceed the withdrawal amounts in the zone designation memo. This slide shows what you might find in a zone designation memo. This is for the zones that occur in the Kennedy County Groundwater Conservation District, and they present an annual pumpage, a 30-year cumulative, and a 50-year cumulative pumpage. So you keep that in the back of your mind, and then you go to the next broad requirement, which is the production authorized from a zone is in addition to the amount of modeled available groundwater for the district. And this is what a chart of modeled available groundwater looks like for Kennedy County. It is divided out by counties that are in the district. Most of these are parts of counties, and then it anticipates by 10-year intervals through the year 2060. And what this brings up is the idea of whether there's double counting in water availability. The MAG itself uses groundwater availability models in the joint planning, and it's likely that they capture formations with up to 3,000 parts per million TDS, because they don't really distinguish between freshwater and brackish water. It's just based on formations. And the designation memos themselves were tasked under House Bill 30 with considering formations with between 1,000 and 10,000 parts per million TDS. Also, as it turns out, the designation memos didn't consider the GAMs or the MAGs. So what you might end up with is double counting of amounts between 1,000 parts per million and 3,000 parts per million. It's likely really that this would first arise in the context of the joint planning process, where the GMA is trying to reconcile the MAG with the designation memos. And it will be addressed on a case-by-case basis between GMAs. Because it's unique to the GMA and to the models that were used in the joint planning, and then the methods that were used in the specific zone designations. And I would venture to say that if you compare the availability in the zone designation memo, and it's a very small percentage of your overall MAG, the GMA group may decide to ignore it and not try to reconcile it, because it's going to be complex, it's going to take time, it's going to be expensive. Now, it is possible that the Texas Water Development Board will undertake a reconciliation, and Natalie Ballou on yesterday's GAM panel, she's with the Texas Water Development Board, talked a little bit about that. So if you want to go back and listen to her presentation, you'll get an idea of what the plans are in that regard. So let me just tell you in a nutshell then what we've just discussed about this very complex topic. You as a district have a certain pot of brackish groundwater within the zones located in your district, and there are X acre-feet per year available for production from that pot per the designation memo. The legislature wants as much as possible of that brackish water to be produced. Therefore, the district has to keep track of production from each zone. And like in Kennedy, we have 2 zones. So we have to keep separate track from each zone. We have to keep track of any of the HB 722 permits, that's the municipal and the electric generation. Any production from other types of use permits producing from the zone, and any production from exempt wells. And then that way they'll be able to compare it to the MAG, and they'll be able to compare it to the zone designation memo, as we just discussed. And then on top of that, production under HB 22 permits, so those are the municipal and the electric generation, can only be limited because of subsidence or water level and water quality declines. And they only can be also limited by any amounts already being produced from each zone. So I'll give you some charts here that show you sort of how Kennedy has parsed all of these requirements in its rules. And we're still working on it. We have we've had, like I said, extensive work sessions, and we've had some stakeholders that have proposed a different method of organizing the rules, and also of what level of technical requirements would be required for certain wells. But anyway, this is sort of what Kennedy is looking at. I wouldn't. You need to ignore the greater than 3,000. This is basically Class D production wells are going to be wells that produce from a brackish groundwater production zone, regardless of the quality of the water, and or from outside of the zone, the Burkeville confining unit or the Jasper aquifer. That's the way Kennedy is approaching it. They want it to be the same in and outside of the zones. So I'm going to call these BGPZ wells, all of those. And so we know, because of the presentation just a few minutes ago, that the cumulative production from a BGPZ has to allow production up to the amount shown in the designation memo, and that amount is over and above the MAG. And then we have two sets of requirements for those. We've got the HB 722 class, which is the municipal and electric generation, and all the technical rules are the same, except that they have the additional water board technical review and water board investigation power. And you look at the other part of the chart, and you can see for other uses, permits for other uses within the zone, it's going to be the same, except for no water board involvement. And then for the wells that are going to be producing from the Burkeville and the Jasper, it would be all uses, not for not those produced from a BGPZ. And where it says produce brackish groundwater, once again, we've done some several reiterations of this rule. And so rather than produce brackish groundwater, it's going to be produced from the Burkeville or the Jasper. We still have the question, is it part of the managed available groundwater? So when we start talking about amounts, all of that has to be recalculated. And just as we mentioned in the non-House Bill 722 wells, it's only the groundwater district who can do the technical review or has the investigation power. So I just wanted to give you a little outline of what your rules could look like. This is what the Kennedy rules look like in terms of what topics are going to be covered. Certainly you can contact me or the district office anytime if you want to see, what the version is looking like at any certain time as we work through what the board's going to ultimately propose. We have established a separate rule for projects in the zone, and that's our Rule 14. And not only is that projects in the zone, but projects in the Burkeville Jasper outside of the zone. We have a section on applicability and general requirements. We are going to require a pre-project meeting, and that section explains what has to be done for that pre-project meeting. We have a section on pre-application activities. There are many, many activities that have to take place in order to have enough information for the application itself, and also, frankly, to decide whether you're interested at all in going forward. And so that's all laid out in the pre-application activities. A section on the content of the application, as we discussed earlier. The Kennedy Board wants the community to receive notice that an application of this sort has been filed. So we have a section on notice of application. We have a section on what the district has to do in terms of the technical review. And I think I mentioned earlier that this is where we set out what it means to be administratively and technically complete for all of these permit applications. We have a section on the content of the permit, and that section lays out what has to be in the permit if it's issued, and it also includes special conditions. And that was discussed yesterday in the panel on GCD management strategies, the different special conditions that could be in a permit. R14.8 includes considerations of the permit by the board, which is sort of a checklist of findings that the board has to make in order to approve permit application and issue a permit. We have a similar provision for all permits, and this one in Rule 14 incorporates the general permit findings and then adds to the findings based on House Bill 722. There's a section on pre-production activities, things like we're going to require a 72-hour pump test. The applicant will have to install elevation measuring equipment and get a baseline reading. It explains the different notifications that have to be made to the district before production can begin. The record keeping and reporting section is, covers the annual report that we talked about and some other reporting. We have a section on what the groundwater district needs to do in terms of requesting an investigation and what its responsibilities are and its procedure if it receives an adverse response from the water board. We've also added, which is not up here, another section outlining all of the technical aspects of the subsidence requirements. And I know that is in effect for the Gulf Coast aquifer, and I think that's the only aquifer it's in effect for, but you could correct me if I'm wrong. The other thing that we did, the board did, is made additional changes to its already existing well construction standards that will be implicated, primarily in these type of wells. These wells that are going to go deep, and they're going to be producing pretty brackish water. Well, before we end, I just wanted to revisit the goals that the legislature has set out for House Bill 22 rules, and sort of evaluate if we're meeting those or can meet those. Greater access, that's fine. Simplifying the procedure, I don't think so. Avoiding delay, I don't think so. Saving expense, probably not. Providing flexibility, I don't think the district is able to provide much flexibility under House Bill 722, and it has to be consistent and not impair property rights, and I'll leave that up to the experts to decide if that's taking place. Well, thanks a lot, and I have really enjoyed talking to you today, and always feel free to call me. I don't mind answering questions on the fly. And like I said, feel free to contact me or Andy Garza at the district if you want a copy of what's going on currently with these rules.